What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to week 3 of the SCX24 budget build-off, where Matt from the Scale Builders Guild and myself are taking the Axial SCX24s and doing our version of a budget build, which is where we take and upgrade these vehicles with $50 every week. This is an 8-week long series. Let's quickly recap what we got done last week. In week 2, we took and installed brass knuckles onto this vehicle, as well as overdrive gears, and we took the RC four-wheel drive steel bead locks and flipped them to give us a wider offset. So that is how we got here after the first 2 weeks. I do have another stock SCX24 Betty now that I can use for some comparison, kind of where we were, where we are now. But now it's time to get into the part where we discuss the modifications that we're doing for this week. This week, we're going to work on improving the center of gravity a little bit more. Last week, we talked about it when we installed the brass knuckles, but this week, we're going to do a little bit more work on there, and I wanted to go in depth a little bit more on center of gravity. I'm sure a lot of you know, but for those of you that don't, I want to do just a quick explanation of what we're doing and why we're doing it. In front of us, we have 3 water bottles. One is empty, one is full, one is partially filled. The center of gravity of an item is basically where all of the mass of an item is averaged into a single point. That's oversimplifying by just a bit, but for the purpose of our discussion today, it'll do. For the purpose of today's discussion, we're just going to consider this to be kind of a consistent volume. The top on this obviously has a little bit of a taper and then a cap and things like that. But for the purpose of this demonstration, these 2 bottles, one empty, one full, will actually have the same center of gravity, basically in the middle of the body as far as the total height, somewhere in there. And why that's important and how it relates to our vehicles is that if you start tilting an item like this, once that center of gravity passes the point where it's in contact with the surface, then it's going to want to tip over. If you're before that point, it'll center itself back. And these 2 bottles, while one is empty and one is full, will react almost the same. Now you can see this has some oscillation, but we can negate that for this. And while that may think that this makes you more stable, it doesn't really, because again, these are going to react about the same. Now if you get them past that angle, they're both going to fall. So heavier doesn't mean more stable. It's all about where the center of gravity is of your actual item. Now, if we substitute in this bottle, which only has a small amount of water in it, but it's down lower, it's not an average that is filled. Now this one, I can go much further than either of these bottles. So it's not just about adding weight, it's where your weight is. If you take and focus that weight down low, you just end up with a much more stable situation. And that is what I want to stress more than anything when setting up an RC car. Whether it's 1/24th or 1/10th, this applies. This applies to everything, full-size vehicles as well. Now, of course, there's other ways to combat, but if all other things being equal, center of gravity as low as possible is the way to go. Now, of course, that's only one portion of the equation of a vehicle setup. That doesn't mean that replacing your axle housings with depleted uranium is a good idea. You don't necessarily want as much weight as possible, and just because it's down low. It's a balance. Now, I went through that entire dissertation just to tell you that we're installing a brass gear cover on the front of our SCX24 this week, and that is, again, to lower the center of gravity. And also, I only installed it in the front as opposed to the rear to keep myself with a forward bias. And for this week, I'll spare you the lecture on that topic. For the brass gear cover this week, I chose a Power Hobbies version, and it's a very simple installation. Basically, we went through that installation last week when we did the overdrive gears because we had to remove it to put the gear set in. So this week, we just went through that same process again. But before putting those last top 2 screws in, I also decided that I was going to replace the servo mount this week. Now, currently, I still have the stock SCX24 servo installed into my SCX24, but I wanted to get into the path of getting ready to upgrade it. Now, this week what I did is I installed a Samix aluminum servo mount that is made specifically to fit the EcoPower or Emax servos. It's a little bit larger, so it doesn't have the exact same bolt pattern as the stock servo. So in order to use the stock servo in there, I just kind of opened those bolt holes to the side on the servo, so I could drop it in there, and it's held firmly in place right now where it will live a temporary life. I will note one thing about the servo. I did swap out the servo horn for one that I happen to just have here in the shop. I don't know where it came from. It fit that very tiny spline and it got rid of the servo saver. It's cheating. I didn't include it in the budget. I don't know what it came from. I don't know how much it cost. It was just here. It was magic. Sometimes magic happens, and therefore it's in my truck. But again, it's going to live a pretty temporary life in there. So if you skip that part of the build, it'll be fine. But that's not all of the modifications for this week. The next thing that we got into was addressing the wheelbase of this vehicle. Now, the Betty that I have here is a bone stock SCX24 Betty. This one is actual serial number 389. Now the wheelbase on this is like 133.4 millimeters. There's another wheelbase available for the SCX24s, and it's almost the same. It's like 133.7, just a very slight difference in wheelbase. However, it's a little bit deceiving because while the wheelbases on the SCX24s are nearly the same, the ratio of link lengths front to rear is fairly drastically different between them. The Betty and the Deadbolt have these very long rear links and some pretty stubby front links. However, like the C10 or the Axial JK, it has closer to equal length front and rear links. Why that's important is that if you buy the long wheelbase kit made for the Axial JK or C10, then you can simply install the front links into the Betty and you end up with a wheelbase that's over 10 millimeters longer than the stock one. You simply buy this Axial plastic link set and you install the front two lower links, which in the kit can be really hard to tell between front and rear since they're almost the same. But the front links actually have an F molded into them. Very hard to see and not obvious. I took and kind of colored it over with a silver Sharpie and then wiped off the top layer to try and show you more clearly where it is. It will not be as obvious as it shows in my video. So you're going to use the front two lower links and then the longer front wishbone for the upper links on the suspension. Now after doing that, it'll push your axle out here to where you see it on my build in front of me here. However, if you do only that, your drive shaft is not going to work. It's going to be too short in the front. Luckily, in the long wheelbase link set from Axial, the female side of the drive shaft is also included. You will have to assemble it, including the little rotation ball. It can be a little bit tricky if you've never done this before. You're gonna need some small pliers. It was really hard to video just because of the tiny size of these parts. But basically you line up one side and then you basically just kind of have to rotate it and snap it into place. It can be a little frustrating at first. Take your time, line things up, use your fingernails and just get it pressed in there. After you get that drive shaft installed, you will now be the proud owner of a long wheelbase SCX24. Like I said, the stock wheelbase is around 133 millimeters. The new wheelbase on this measures about 144. So a nice little bump in wheelbase. It's almost making these two vehicles look like a different scale, but I'm digging it. We're starting to get a pretty aggressive, performance-oriented little SCX24 here. Now, one thing that I didn't do after extending the wheelbase was adjust the location of the upper shock mount. Now, in stock form, the shocks are almost vertical. Now, they've got a little bit of an angle to them. And what that does is also gives me a little bit more suspension travel. In stock form, the SCX24 axle goes up until the shocks bottom out. So it's being shock limited. So by laying the shocks back, we extend the functional length of them slightly. The functional stroke of the shock will go from the just physical length of it if they're perfectly vertical to almost infinity if you lay them to match the actual angle of the links. If the shocks were actually in line with the links, then they actually have almost no functional ability at all. The axle would move completely freely until it was limited by some other situation, like the actual suspension binding or a drive shaft, a servo wire, whatever it was. But having some shock angle can be a nice little addition to give yourself a little bit more suspension travel. One thing that I forgot to mention last week was the new track width measurement. In stock form, we were at 108 millimeters. Now our track width is at 127. So almost an inch wider with these large tires and flipped wheels. Big difference, as you can tell here, from one to the other. But like everything else, side effects of our decisions. Longer wheelbase, larger tires, increased track width, scrub steer like we talked about. A side effect of all of those decisions was that our Little Guy Racing Parts tires and our front bumper were trying to occupy the same space. Not gonna work. We had 3 options to try and tackle this though. First one is take the stock bumper and just trim it until everything clears. That's a very budget-friendly option. But if we were going to do that, it was going to completely remove the LED lights that were in the front bumper, and the LEDs look kind of cool. So that wasn't the top of my list. Plus, with how much we were gonna have to cut to clear, we weren't gonna have much bumper left, and it definitely wasn't gonna look very good. Second option was to purchase new bumpers. Being that this is a budget build though, things can get a little tight. I did have a couple of options here in-house. The first one that I had was specific to the C10 and not gonna work on the Betty. It's wider than the stock bumper was. Really wasn't going to solve a single problem that we had. So that one was immediately out, as would be expected. The next option was this one from Power Hobby that's kind of aggressive and narrow with a stinger on it. This one I actually like the looks of, and I thought that might be a decent option. However, once I put it onto the chassis and checked clearances, my servo was starting to hit it, and the tires were still gonna get in the way. So even though it looked good and it had a place for the LEDs, it wasn't going to solve our problem, so that one was also out. Now, the third option was to build our own. 3D printing is a powerful option, and a lot of people are starting to have 3D printers at home. So my decision was to design my own and then 3D print it. I like to use Fusion 360 for modeling here at home. So I opened up Fusion 360 and started on the design. My very first design didn't work out. I didn't spend enough time measuring, and the design of it was just too tight to the chassis. The servo hit, the tires were still in the way. So didn't work out. But from there, I just kept iterating, and I moved the bumper out. I made some clearance for the body. I made some clearance for the servo, and then I brought it all back in until it was tight too. All of those things that I was worried about. And after I got a bumper that fit and cleared everything, I started working on the aesthetics of it a little bit more. I wanted to retain the LEDs, so I added a couple of little LED pods on top of the bumper to look more like off-road lights would appear. And then I added a bull bar or a stinger on top of it as well. I added some little retainers onto the back side of those LEDs so that the stock lights popped in and then were held in place almost exactly like the factory bumper did. So now I have a nice narrow bumper that perfectly clears my tires with that extended wheelbase and clears my servo through the entire travel of the suspension. Now I will be sharing that STL file that I created for the bumper. I'll upload it to my Thingiverse and I'll link it in the description below. If you have a 3D printer, you can simply download it and print it yourself. If you don't, maybe you know somebody or there's one at school, whatever it is, hopefully you can find somebody to print one out for you without charging you anything. If you can't find anybody, there's also services like Shapeways where you can have it printed. I'll upload it to my Shapeways. You can have it printed through there. I won't put any markup or profit on it at all, so anything that you have to pay will just be for Shapeways. I won't be padding the price to try and make money on my side. Now, this is the first time that I'm using 3D printing in this season of the budget build. It won't be the last time, but I'll try not to overuse it for those of you that just aren't interested in doing it yourself or purchasing one or learning about it or any part of it. So I'll try not to overuse it, but you are gonna see it again. Since I did 3D print it myself, I'm not gonna add anything to the budget for it specifically. Cost of filament is almost nothing. Maybe it's breaking the rules, maybe it's not, I don't know. I'll beg for forgiveness rather than ask for permission. But Speaking of the budget, let's get into the tally for this week. The brass gear cover that we installed this week cost us $15.99. The Axial link set cost us $11.99. And the Samick servo mount that we installed was $14.99. Totaling all those things up, $42.97. Last week, we had a remainder of $9.05, and adding that to this week's $50 budget, $59.05. Subtracting those two numbers, we end up with $16.08 remaining to carry over into next week. Now, next week is a non-standard week in the budget build. It is free week, but have no fear, any remainder of the budget that we have is going to get spent. We're going to spend every dime of it by the end, I promise. But with that, that's gonna do it for this week. Make sure and go check out Matt's video for week 3. I'll link to it in the description below. As always, I appreciate you guys for watching the budget build. Make sure and hit the like button if you enjoy these videos. Subscribe if you're not already, and hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. Once again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.